Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about the shortlist from the International Booker Prize. I finally finished reading all 6, so here's me sort of reviewing them sort of in totality, kind of all together. So let's get talking about them. Just in a sort of broader sense as well, I've enjoyed reading this shortlist so far. The long list, sorry, so far. I've still got a couple of books to finish, to sort of finish reading the long list. But overall, I kind of think it's quite a good one, particularly given that this is, well, I say good one. It's a mixed one. I think I started this year having read none of the long list at all, which is the first time, normally 1 or 2 of sort of books I've read. So it was interesting for me to kind of go in for quite a lot of books that I hadn't heard of and hadn't really expected to be there. And they haven't always necessarily been my favourites. It's never going to be the way with a whole shortlist or a whole long list. I mean, yeah, even a shortlist. I find this with going through the Booker Prize shortlists at the moment. Very rarely do I really love every book on a shortlist. And it would be kind of quite weird if I did every year, because it's a rotating panel of judges. They're trying to appeal as well to many different reading tastes and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of natural. But it is interesting. And I think this long list and this short list, it's interesting to know, I don't think I've had a book yet that's been a 5-star read for me. There have been a couple that are very close, and luckily those are on the shortlist. But yeah, so it's interesting. But anyway, let's get started talking about the shortlist from this year. Because I'm filming this video before the winner has been announced, I'll go through the authors' names by surname, in alphabetical order by surname. So we have first Selva Almada's Not a River, translated by Annie McDermott, which is also the first book I read from the whole long list, because I already had it and it's very short. And it's a very targeted, focused novel that talks about this set of characters all growing up around this one region. And I really love the sort of tense, focused nature of it, because we've got this one rural community in Argentina and a group of characters who don't really speak much in some cases, and particularly the men in this book don't speak a whole lot. There's a group of men who all go and fish, basically, and while they're fishing, they occasionally talk about things, and part of what they talk about is the sort of curse or sort of the stories that seem to follow around this neighborhood, and particularly this river, or this body of water. And we then sort of see how in and around that neighborhood is a real focus on the characters having to follow the script almost set for them. You're born into this area, you do a job that your parent had, you get married, have children, and kind of repeat the cycle for the next generation. And what is kind of problematized within this book is then sort of where things start to go wrong. So not only is that sort of idea of things passed down generation to generation, but also various curses or various prophecies almost for what's happening in the area seem to get passed down. And so I think there's something really interesting about the way that this book just really focuses this narrative towards this building idea of something happening, and just this very big sort of almost this kind of sense of no resolution. We're still moving towards something that is never quite going to happen or change. And I think the book leaves that question somewhat unanswered at the end here, which I thought was really, really well done. And so I think this is a really clever and really impressive, very, very short novel. Next up, Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck, and translated by Michael Hofmann. And this is the most recent one I've read. And I think this is a really interesting book. I kind of went into it with some trepidation, thinking mostly that I'd really like it, but also not knowing what to expect. And I think, like many of her books, from what I understand, she writes a lot about East Germany and particularly East Berlin. And there's this sort of sense of, she's almost a chronicler of the history of that place, and particularly that it's had such an interesting history, and it's still a history that is very much sort of monumental in modern day Germany. And so Jenny Erpenbeck writes about the sort of love affair essentially between two people. There's a significant age gap. We have the sort of younger woman and an older man, Catalina, who's the younger woman, and Hans, who's this old man, and their relationship sort of they have it's a really intense relationship in many ways. Not only while it's happening, where they have these really in-depth conversations about art and history and philosophy and music and all these other things, that really wraps around this whole book, that these characters are just having these really in-depth conversations. But then there's an intensity to when the relationship ends, where they also find themselves in kind of with sort of the geopolitics almost of East and West Germany playing out in that as well. And without giving away too much of what comes up towards the end of the book also looks at how the politics of the region really shapes their ability to be part of that relationship. And what I think is also really impressive about this book is the way that it often shifts narrative style to really reflect what's going on. So occasionally we have these long passages that almost feel like somebody is exercising a kind of demon from them, you know, sort of a panicked state of maybe 4 or 5 pages in almost stream of consciousness, where Katarina is just expelling all these ideas of feeling anxious about, will he call, will he do this, does this thing mean this? And at one point they have a separation that's very close after they've just had this really beautiful day together, and so there's a sort of a going back and re-picking through everything to understand what had gone wrong, which I think is really interesting. And I'm really intrigued by the way the book constructs these narratives around it. Or, you know, we've got excerpts from recordings, and those sort of play into one person just having to listen to how the relationship happened. So I think it's a really intriguing book, and one that I think would actually become a lot deeper on rereading, which is often a big thing for the Booker, or for any prize. Generally books that, because these books will often be read 2 or 3 times by the time the winner's picked, that often means that books that really that have that extra little depth that you can go back and revisit, they tend to do quite well. So I wouldn't be surprised if Kairos actually ends up taking the win in the end because of that itself. I think it's a really complex and really interesting novel in many ways. Next up, we have The Details by Genberg. And this is a very slight, very short novel that sort of passes by. It's almost like a, you know, I know the sort of phrase around quiet novels can be kind of overused, and I've definitely I think I've overused it as well. This book does sort of live up to that in some ways. It's these 4 episodic elements that make it up, that almost read like short essays or sort of thoughts kind of just jotted down, but they build into sort of a wider narrative about something that I found really quite compelling. So essentially it's somebody looking back over 4 people who have been fairly important in their life, often sort of romantic relationships, and these people sort of seem to come and go. And actually the fact that it's in these 4 almost vignettes kind of allows this book to sort of look at the kind of the intense ways that people can be in your life for specific moments and then disappear. And sometimes they linger in your thoughts or in other ways, but sometimes in these vignettes or these moments talking about somebody else, we get a sense that this other person not necessarily been moved on from, but that they've had their time. Some of these characters seem to sort of appear a bit later again, and there's something kind of interesting about it. So it's quite an intriguing book, because really ultimately at the end, this book, and this is not a spoiler, but this book sort of then looks at, well, what does it mean to be human? And is being human and is getting on with life just acknowledging that some people come into your life and then leave again, and that some people you hold on to. And although that sounds quite basic in some ways, the way this book approaches that is very much that they don't have to be a lesson for you, though they can be. They can just be a season that kind of comes and goes, and you don't necessarily need to think about it. And part of being alive, and the final few lines of this book really dig into this as well, part of being alive is that sort of just experiencing it and then continuing. And so there's something quite profound and quite interesting happening here. And again, I think a book that might hold up really well to some rereading. So I see why it's made it to a shortlist now, even though it's a book that I don't think I really thought I'd get on with, perhaps, particularly from sort of initially reading about it. Next, in a shortlist with a lot of very short novels, we have a slightly longer one. This is Mata 210 by Hwang Sok-yong. And this is a really big and kind of almost audaciously big book in its scope. So it is a book that focuses on three really big moments in Korean history, and particularly told through the perspective of people who are working class and are kind of part of a union struggle for better rights. And so there's something quite interesting in the way this book is set up, in the sense that it is in many ways a very historical book. It has these long passages that are there to give flavour to what was happening at the time, but told mostly through these three generations of various parts of industrial life in Korea, all the way from sort of pre-split, so when Korea was Korea, or Joseon kind of at the time, and not South Korea, North Korea, but also a time under Japanese occupation. And so we've got these moments of how a nation comes to find out who it is, and kind of as a result, who the kind of the ever-changing target of who the enemy is for much of this, because the enemy in this book is at various points Japan and colonialism and capitalism and bosses and various other things, and it kind of explores your sense of identity and nationhood through work, which I thought was really well done. I will say, for me, it sagged a little bit. I found it a little bit too big at times. But also I think there's something, this almost feels like an author going for a sort of magnum opus of, you know, I want to tell these people's stories. And in the afterword, the author, there's a note that the author spent a lot of time speaking to people, and it was sparked from a conversation with someone from Pyongyang, which is modern day North Korea. And so a lot of the conversation that came out of this was about how you tell some of those stories, how you make sure that these people's voices are not sort of lost to the sands of time. So I think it's really bold in that sense as well, that it's aiming to be a voice for a lot of those people as well. Next up, we have What I'd Rather Not Think About by Jente Posthuma, and translated by Sarah Timmer Harvey. And it's a book that I think is really, yeah, I think I really just loved. It's a very sort of short focused book. It's sort of told in these little vignettes. I don't know what I'm doing with my hands. It's told in these little vignettes. So some of these are a page long, or even less sometimes. I think the longest I remember seeing was about 4 or 5 pages or thereabouts. It's very kind of choppy in that sense, but it looks a lot at grief, and particularly somebody mourning the loss of a twin, and how that kind of can show itself in this quite complicated way, because somebody is there sort of seeing a life that could have been and not been, and, you know, all these sorts of things come into the narrative. But particularly this book is quite not absurd, but it has a very almost sardonic tone. It's a book that's seeped in so much sadness throughout the book, but told often with this sort of detached, wry humor. We see these little moments of almost silliness, and they feel funnier because of how tragic things are, and the tragedy feels a lot more tragic because of the comedy. You know, proper kind of tragicomic things going on in a way that I found really interesting, because exploring grief through this lens feels so almost gutter humor. But there's something really profound about the way this book does it. It could, I think so easily, this book could feel quite throwaway and quite insignificant, but there's something really true being unveiled behind each of these little humorous, these sort of humorous little sort of vignettes. And so I just thought it's a really interesting book. It really caught me off guard. It's a book that I really raced through and absolutely loved, and thought was really profound and really beautiful in what it's trying to do. Yeah, it's just a really fascinating little book, and I kind of think I'm rooting for it a lot more than I really thought I would be at the beginning of all of this. And last but not least, Crooked Plow by Itamar Vieira Jr. and translated by Johnny Lorenz. And this is a really fascinating book, I think, in quite a lot of ways. I mentioned in Martha 210 this sort of intergenerational tale, and this book does this really fascinatingly, I think, as well, told particularly through looking at 3 generations of women in a really poor region of Brazil. And this is an area of Brazil that's also these 3 women's lives are also touched by the sort of the after effects and long shadow of of slavery and various other things. And so we see these women trying to eke out an existence in this really tough, very dry area. They're subsistence farmers. They're trying to just make it work and kind of get through the day. But what's and sort of as a result, they have to be these sort of very hardened people. They can't as easily show emotion as they want to, because there's a degree of, you have to always be ready to fight. And in some ways that bleeds into so much of the key narrative, because the book opens with a really bold scene involving a knife. And this knife is sort of believed to have these powers. There's a sort of superstition and a sort of mythos around this knife that seems to suggest the kind of curse or this sort of generational thing. And in some ways this book then plays into that really interesting idea about generational things passed on, almost a generational trauma of this knife, this violence must live with every generation. And at some point this might save you and might protect you. At some points this might destroy you. And we see for one character really early on, it radically alters the entire course of her life. And so we spend the whole book watching sort of a what could have been sort of narrative again, really. And I think there's something so fascinating about the way this book constructs that it's so woven in with a kind of a brutal reality at times, and also this sort of magical, ethereal, fantastical sort of narrative as well. And so to the extent where sometimes you're not quite sure where you stand on that tightrope, which I think is something really quite special about this book as well, particularly given that it's a book that has so much violence and so much brutality, but also just this sense of something potentially lingering that could hit at any point as well. So that's the shortlist. And I realized as I've been talking about it, how much more I enjoyed some of these books than I realized. They're really quite interesting in a lot of ways. I think, I mentioned generations a lot of times, this idea of passing on something, this sort of legacy. And I think these books explore that in a really interesting way. What is life and what do you pass along? What do you keep? What do you take with you? All of these sorts of things I think are sort of show up in these novels in a really interesting way. And the more I've read from the long list, the more I kind of am agreeing with the short list. I think that these books I think are a really strong six. I think they speak to each other in a really interesting way. And that's often a really good thing within a shortlist, where it's more than just the 6 books individually. These 6 books together show something about either moving a conversation forward, or a global perspective on a topic, or a sort of a sort of something that is on everybody's minds. So something I find really fascinating about all these books together, really. And I think as well, just in terms of quality writing, I think there's some really wonderfully sort of powerful prose going on, which I think really speaks to the translators as well. I realised earlier I forgot to mention the translators for Marta 210, Sora Kim Russell and Youngjae Josephine Bay. And I think for all the translators involved in this, there's some really incredible work going on in not only how you tell stories from other places and how you kind of convey that in English, but often the things that you don't change. There's an opening essay in Marta 210 that talks about leaving some Korean words just in Korean, because to translate them into English takes away something about the localized feel of that word, or the very specific nature of it, or even the kind of specific time zone, time period that word existed in, that actually that's a North Korean word, or that's a South Korean word now, but at the time sort of sat between them. So it's a really interesting set of books for that as well. And I think this is the great thing with the International Booker, is being able to see translated fiction coming together in such a fascinating way. All of which leaves the idea of choosing a winner now. And I think, I've sort of alluded to it, I think, as we've gone, but I think for me, my personal winner is probably between Crooked Plow and What I'd Rather Not Talk About. I think both of them are just really compelling and really narratively intriguing books that do a lot on the page, but also leave a lot to kind of discuss afterwards. But I do also think that a book like Kairos is a really fascinating one that kind of snuck up on me, because for a lot of the book I wasn't fully sure what was happening or why I sort of cared. And then there were these little moments of something shifting ever so slightly on the page that made me realize sort of some of the chess pieces being moved, and I suddenly saw parts of what was going on. I think it's exceptionally clever, even if I think at times it can feel slightly off-putting because it does feel distanced. I think that's part of the point of this book, but I think just overall a really fantastic set of books, and I'm intrigued to see who wins now. Yeah. Who are you rooting for the win? What books have you really enjoyed or not enjoyed? Are there any from the long list you'd like to see in the shortlist? All of that good stuff. Take care. It's been really fun reading the International Booker this year. I'll carry on reading the last couple from the shortlist, from the long list. And I'll follow up with a couple of last single reviews for the last two on here that I've not reviewed yet, as solo reviews. But it's been fun. Take care, and we shall find out a winner in about a week's time from when this video goes out. So let's see what happens. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.